good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. Welcome to the second of our webinars organized by the RésEAU, the water network of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, in partnership with the Trend Observatory on Water. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you'll enjoy today's webinar. My name is Melissa, I work for SCAT, and I'll be facilitating our webinar today, which is on adapting water resources management to a vanishing mountain cryosphere. Before we get started, I just want to take a few minutes to make sure you're all familiar with the system we're using and you're able to solve any technical issues. You can think of it a bit like the safety instructions that you get before an airplane takes off. So the main thing to know is that you have a chat box on the bottom left of the screen, where you can see, where you'll be able to communicate with us and with all the other webinar participants. If you don't see it, you need to click on an icon with a bubble, a speech bubble, and then you'll be able to see it. You should also see on the top left of your screen a box with all the webinar participants, including yourself. Please just be aware that just stay on mute if it's possible. I think some of you might not be on mute, and I think that might be Rebecca. Okay, that's good. So if we stay on mute, that makes it easier for people to hear the webinar. Okay. So I just want to make sure you can use the chat box properly. So and also just to get to know who's on the call, could I please ask all of you to type in your name, an organization, and the country where you're based at the moment to see where you're joining us from, and we can know more about who's attending the webinar today as well. Thank you. So I'll do that now. Great, wonderful. Now that these technical issues are sorted, we can start with the content of today's session, which is on adapting water resources management to vanishing mountain cryosphere. And you could be forgiven for not knowing much about the cryosphere. I did a quick survey of people in my bubble to ask who knew what the cryosphere was. No one was really sure, so it's okay if you feel that you don't know much about it, you're not alone. However, you should know that almost 25% of the population depends on the mountain cryosphere for their main source of water. And by cryosphere, we mean the glaciers, the snow, the permafrost, and the ice in mountain areas. This is particularly important for us then in the RésEAU as water specialists. And the people who depend on this are not only people who live in mountain areas, can also be people living downstream in arid and semi-arid areas. And why is this of importance? It's because these water towers, due to climate change, are shrinking everywhere around the world, and therefore we need to think about what this means for water resources management. In this webinar, we will therefore discuss these issues with scientific expertise and practical experience. We will talk about what we need to do to adopt more transformative approaches to water resources management to deal with the uncertainties associated with a vanishing mountain cryosphere. I just want to highlight as well, we are present on Twitter, on other social networks. If you want, feel free to share your thoughts about this webinar using the hashtag RésEAU webinar, all in one word. Now, I just want to also quickly introduce the people involved in this webinar. So you can see me, Melissa, and the presenters. There will be Annika Kramer from Adelphi, who is responsible for leading on the Trend Observatory, or the Trend sheet dedicated to this topic, as well as Natalia Acero from Conservation International Colombia, who will present some practical experience of transformational approaches to water resources management in mountain areas. We also have the pleasure of having two colleagues from SDC, André Verli, who will be our discussant today, and Daniel Marcelli, who is the RésEAU focal point. Meanwhile, we have our colleagues helping us with all the organization in the background, Martin, Maria, and Arlette. Okay, now I'm going to hand over to Daniel Marcelli, who is our RésEAU focal point, and Senior Policy Advisor for the Global Program Water at SDC, who will provide a brief overview of the RésEAU and the Trend Observatory. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Melissa. A warm welcome to everybody. great that you have decided and taken some time to join our webinar. We have decided to some time back within the global program Water, of which I'm part of the team, to be trying to anticipate and to analyze possible trends that are relevant in the sector of water, and also, of course, in connection with other sectors. So that is the background a little bit for this Trend Observatory that has been installed and has now a website. As you can see here on this slide, there's a link to that website at the moment. If you go to the next slide, please, Melissa. We want to actually, as I said, anticipate, but also try to analyze global trends and then look into possible opportunities or whether we are challenged or facing issues linked to these trends. Let's take artificial intelligence, for instance, and we want to see how this could be impacting the water sector in which we are active. The global program Water, just as a side comment, is active on 4 realms: water and peace, water, planet, and prosperity, also water voices, giving voices to different actors, and then, of course, a traditional domain, water, sanitation, and hygiene for people, very much in discussion now with the pandemic. Another aim is to inform and to exchange with practitioners, so people like you also, about these trends and how to go about them to either overcome the challenges they pose or actually to seek solutions and opportunities that present themselves. The target audience are 3. Foremost, of course, we are addressing our own constituency, the RésEAU, which is one of 11 thematic networks of SDC, the water network, and has more than 500 people. Then, of course, any kind of other practitioners in the field of development cooperation, but ultimately we hope that we also have other who are interested either as individuals or organizations to read about these trends in the sector of water. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. Now, what are we producing? What is this Trend Observatory producing? Today, we will have a webinar on a trend sheet. So we elaborated a trend sheet on the topic that we're dealing with today. And then we thought it's good to present it and to discuss it so that people can react and also enrich even our thinking. And we can share that. We do these webinars connected to that. We have also started producing trend news a bit more frequently. The trend sheets appear 1, 2, or 3 times a year, depending on how much resources we have available and people who can help in developing these trend sheets. But trend news are meant to be coming up a bit more regularly. And actually, there is also a possibility to make own suggestions on which trends, news that should be included on this platform. The topics so far have included digital technologies that have been addressing or looking into the inequalities of the water sector that are linked to these technologies. There has been a first trend sheet and also video material prepared for that. There's a virtual reality application in the water sector, but we are also looking, as is our global program, into the aspect of circular economy in water management, and preparing now a next trend sheet on hydrogen production, potential impact on water security, that will be hopefully produced in a few weeks from now onwards. So these are a few insights into the Trend Observatory that is handled by Adelphi, with whom we have a contract. And we will now hear from Annika the presentation on today's topic and then continue in the program that has been presented to you by Melissa. But thanks again for joining, and thanks also for all those who have had an active part in preparing and in participating. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Before I hand over to Annika, I just want to give a brief overview of the agenda. So we'll have the pleasure of hearing Annika present the trend sheet that she led on this topic of adaptation to a vanishing mountain cryosphere. And then we will have our special guest, Natalia Acero from Conservation International, who will present a practical case study of adaptation in mountain areas before hearing from our discussants. And then we will have a question and answer sessions. This is based on your questions, so feel free to write your comments or suggestions, questions, feedback in the chat box, and we will take them after all the presentations, if that's okay. So Annika, I'll just quickly introduce you. You're head of water programs at Adelphi. Your work also focuses on international cooperation, resource governance, vulnerability and adaptation to climate change, and you lead the consultancy mandate for SDC's Trend Observatory on water. Over to you, Annika. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for the introduction. Can you put on my first slide?
That should be it.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah. As has been introduced, I'm going to in my presentation, I'm going to summarize one of the recent trend sheets that we have prepared for the Trend Observatory, focusing on mountain cryosphere and its importance to water resource management. So in my presentation, I will outline the state of research and how changes in the mountain cryosphere will impact water resources, and provide some general approaches on how to adapt water management accordingly. Next slide, please. First of all, of course, there was the question of what is the mountain cryosphere. Melissa has already introduced it a little bit, maybe just to highlight the difference between cryosphere in general and the mountain cryosphere. So while cryosphere in general is an all-encompassing term for those portions of the Earth's surface where water is in solid form, so including ice shelf in the Arctic, etc., mountain cryosphere only encompasses glaciers, snow, permafrost, and ice in mountain areas. Cryosphere in mountain areas are an important component of the hydrological cycle, as they store water in the form of snow and ice during the winter period and release it as melting water during warmer seasons. So like this, mountain cryosphere forms natural water towers, as Melissa has mentioned, that supply billions of people with water. And those this refers to people living in the mountain areas, but also people living downstream. And it's therefore alarming that mountain cryosphere is vanishing almost everywhere in the world due to global warming. Indeed, recent research highlights that the world's most important water towers, in terms of their water supplying role for downstream ecosystems in society, are also among the most vulnerable to climatic and socioeconomic changes due to the lack of alternative water sources, the existing governance settings, etc. Next slide, please. So if we take a more detailed look into how climate change effects on mountain cryosphere impact freshwater resources, we can see that global warming results, on the one hand, in slow onset changes, for example, in the amount and seasonality of river runoff, as well as in hydrological extremes, floods in particular. Many of those effects can already be felt, but are projected to further increase in the future. I would now only like to highlight two of the most typical impacts: changes in runoff and changes in rain on snow floods, also to highlight their variability over space and time. Next, please. As glaciers melt, summer and annual water runoff typically first increases for some years or decades until a point in time called peak water, beyond which runoff steadily declines due to glacier shrinkage. What is alarming again is that projections point to the fact that in all regions of the world, average annual runoff from glaciers will have reached that peak that will be followed by declining runoff already by the end of the century. As a result, summer runoff is predicted to decline over the 21st century in many basins due to less snowfall and decrease in glacier melt after peak water. Winter runoff instead is projected to further increase in many rivers over this century due to more precipitation falling as rain instead of snow and increased winter snow melt in a steadily warming climate. Next, please. If we look at extreme events, changes in the frequency of rain and snow floods are typical. Rain on snow floods originate from the combination of rapidly melting snow and intense rainfall and are often devastating. While their frequency is projected to increase in higher elevation, it is projected to decrease at lower elevation. Next, please. So what we can see in consequence is that future changes in mountain cryosphere are definitely projected to affect water resources and their uses, such as irrigated agriculture and hydropower in high mountain areas, as well as in lowlands downstream. However, the cause-effect relationships are very complex, and the impacts differ significantly between seasons and among regions, and therefore require detailed regional impact analysis. While regional climate and hydrological modeling can help inform water resources management, still these projections come along with significant uncertainties. Uncertainties not only remain in projections of future climate change impacts on freshwater resources, but also related to future socioeconomic conditions that shape water dependency and vulnerability to climate change. Uncertainties are especially high in mountain areas because in these remote areas, monitoring networks are often insufficiently dense and fieldworks in high mountains is complicated. In the face of remaining uncertainties, water resource management and planning needs to be based on integrated assessments of climate-related risks that take into account projections, as I said, of the regional climate change effects and the socioeconomic developments. And as these projections cannot be made with certainty, risk assessments will help to assess the vulnerability of the system as well as the extent and likelihood to which, for example, the water supply will not meet the defined needs. Several tools and guidance documents for climate risk and vulnerability assessment have been developed, but they need to be used more broadly in water resources management planning. I listed here two of instruments that we found particularly useful. One of them, the Climate, Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction Integration Guidance tool developed by SDC, and a bit more recent, the Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis approach that has been developed by UNESCO and partners. Next, please. So while risk assessments help to better factor in uncertainties related to future conditions, they cannot eliminate these uncertainties. Therefore, management of water resources that depend on mountain cryosphere needs to adopt solutions that are robust, which means that they perform well over a wide range of climate and non-climate scenarios, or that are flexible enough to be easily adapted to changing conditions. Examples of robust solutions include multiple benefit solutions, or often also called no-regret solutions, that provide benefits irrespective of climate change impact. For example, water demand management or water conservation, or conservation of wetlands for water storage, which provide co-benefits for mountain biodiversity and livelihoods, and therefore are beneficial even if climate change has different impacts than projected. Indeed, building up storage capacity is very important in order to deal with the lost storage capacity of the glaciers. Here we may also learn from experiences in other mountain areas, like from the example in Colombia that is going to be presented next, even if the rivers there are no longer fed by glaciers. What is important that integrated storage concepts should also consider enhancing natural storage potential, as this may, on the one hand, bring multiple benefits, but also such nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches for adaptation in general have proven to be more resilient and also being more flexibly adapted than hard infrastructure. Another option to robust solutions are reversible or flexible solutions, like, for example, governance approaches that can be more easily adapted to changing conditions. Next, please. Having said this, I would like to highlight that continuing temperature increase will fundamentally change high mountain cryosphere and montane ecosystems. And this is expected to cause indeed profound alteration of the hydrologic regime in the dependent basins as glaciers disappear irreversibly. These changes will likely be so fundamental that they'll render incremental adaptation of the existing system of water use and management insufficient. What will therefore most likely be needed is more substantive systemic changes, so-called transformational adaptation. For example, if after peak water resources get ever scarcer, for example, then farmers may have to really substantially change their farming system or their source of income in order to use water more effectively for generating income, not only more efficiently to produce their crops. For example, by planting either completely different, highly drought-resistant crops, by changing their livelihoods to pastoralism or ecotourism, where this is possible, or even by moving downhill for search of wage labor. Decision makers should anticipate radical climate change impact, assess at what point transformational approaches are needed, and prepare for it. Having said this, we have to observe that there is still substantive need to develop and better study transformational adaptation processes. The current research, however, shows that the main challenges in achieving transformational adaptation are overcoming technical path dependencies and bringing about institutional and societal change. Therefore, a large part of the solution will lie in raising awareness and political will in engaging communities and communication activities to change behaviors. I hope that from the next presentation, we will get some further insights on how this transformational change may be brought about and what transformational change indeed encompasses. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Annika, for this really great overview. I just want to encourage everyone to take a look at the trend sheet that Annika is presenting now. My colleague Maria has pasted a link in the chat box. You can go and check it out. Everything is explained in much more details than what Annika presented here, and it's very interesting also to take a look at it in more details. I just want to now present our next speaker, Natalia Acero. She is the Water and Cities Director for Conservation International Colombia, joining us from Colombia very early in the morning, her time. She has focused her research on understanding the multiple benefits that freshwater ecosystem services bring to people. Her current work focuses on nature-based solutions for water supply and regulation issues. She will present an example of transformational adaptation in mountain areas with regards to water resources management. Natalia, if you're here, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, Melissa, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining and for giving us the opportunity to show our work in Colombia. As Melissa mentioned, I'm Natalia Acero, the Water and Cities Director of Conservation International Colombia. Conservation International is an NGO that has presence in 30 different countries around the world. And the biggest goal or our aim is to protect ecosystems that provide services and well-being to people. What I'm going to show you today is an example of integrated water management in high mountain ecosystems in Colombia. Next slide, please. And I'm going to focus the presentation of the work that we are doing in Bogota. Sorry, Melissa, I cannot see that you are moving the slides.
Yeah, I can move them if you just tell me.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to focus my presentation on the work that we are doing in Bogota. Next slide, please. We have developed a sustainable landscape approach for a strategy that is called the Paramos Conservation Corridor, that basically is that yellow line that you can see in the map. What we want to do here is to promote conservation of key ecosystem services, restoration in areas that still promote some freshwater ecosystem services, and to foster sustainable agriculture production, basically sustainable production systems. This and the main goal is to provide the water supply that Bogota and the region that are basically 22 municipalities needs. Bogota, just to have a little bit of context, has around 8 million people. In the 22 municipalities, we have around 2 million people, rural people, that lives, and all the income is based on agriculture, basically potato and milk production. And all this region and what you see within the yellow line is the hydrological, what we call the hydrological region that supports water regulation and water supply to the city. What we do basically is to protect a very unique ecosystem that is called páramos, or high Andean wetlands. That it's mainly on those green areas that you see right now. They are regional, national, or local protected areas that basically conserve that unique ecosystem. Next slide, please. So the connection here with the topic and with the mountain cryosphere is to let you know or understand that here in the high Andean mountains, all this area used to be a glacier. We have a glacier heritage here. We have 3 different major glacier events. And 3000 before Christ, we had the last one, which produces the disappearance of perpetual snows and ice caves in the region. This used to be a glacier. But what is very interesting here, and that's why we wanted to show this in this webinar, is that what the wetlands or the páramos, this ecosystem is doing is basically the same function as a glacier. It is still an ecosystem that this main function is to store water, and to, as the glacier, when we have dry seasons, the runoff, these ecosystems works as a sponge. So it provides water when we have a dry season downstream, and then storage water when we have the wet season. So it's very interesting how climate change and the different earth events that we had, glacier transform into a páramo, and the páramo still, even if it is less amount of water as the glacier used to, but these páramos still provides that very essential function as water storage. Next slide, please. So here in the Paramos Conservation Corridor, we have evaluated what is our climate risk based on climate change scenarios, hydrological modeling, land use modeling, and try to understand where we are going to have a reduced water storage, mainly because of changing temperature and precipitation, and how we can adapt to those changes to still be able to provide water to the big city, but also to provide water to ecosystems and to agriculture systems that basically are based on the water that the páramos provides. So based on these maps, we have developed an ecosystem-based adaptation strategy. Next slide, please. Based on a concept that is called transformative adaptation. This transformative adaptation responses fundamentally to change on social and ecological systems and try to understand what are their interactions, how the ecosystem have structure, functions, and how people that lives on that has an effect on the way that all those natural and biophysical dynamics interact, but also how it affects that dynamics and what are the roots of vulnerability. Next, please. So we have identified that there are 6 main concepts that characterize a transformative adaptation. The first one will be that it should be a persistent adaptation. That means that should go across generations. It should be system-wide, should cover an entire landscape that we identify that have some socio-ecological connection or links. Should be innovative, try to introduce new states, relation, technologies, and behavior on how people downstream is responsible or what happened in upstream and how those dynamics should be in equilibrium and should interact. The next one should be a multi-scale, should involve multiple spatial characteristics from the local to the national level, but also should have different governmental and sectoral scales. So everyone should be involved in the protection and adaptation to climate change. A transformative adaptation should look for a path shifting in development, in sustainability, looking for resilience or equity. And the main concept should be restructuring. It should change the way ecosystem services and land use are being used. Next, please. So just a little bit of what we've done here in the conservation paramos in Bogota. The first thing that we should understand is that in dry season, we are having very low runoff that is not supplying enough water to fulfill the demand. The demand for irrigation for potato fields, the demand for industrial uses, and the demand for domestic uses for rural, for municipalities, and for the big city. So in that terms, what we've been looking for restructuring this behavior is to change the way that water consumption, the way that people uses water resources for water consumption in agriculture and domestic uses. Here we have 3 examples. We have developed automated irrigation systems for potato and for pastures, for milk production. As we are 2,600 meters above sea level, and we have a lot of fog, basically, we try to use fog traps to intercept horizontal precipitation that could help us on very specific uses in the farms, such as irrigation for different vegetables. And also we have implemented some reservoirs in the high areas to provide water to irrigation for irrigation or for cutoff. We also are working on reversing the trends of high mountain and paramos degradation. Next slide, please. What we do here is to basically try to conserve the paramos and the high Andean forest that still remain. We try to preserve it by isolation and working with the community in conservation agreements. In areas where we still think that there's an opportunity for restoration, we are using nucleation strategies to promote or to have active restoration, but also to promote connection between those nucleus by different strategies, such as using birds or mammals to support that restoration activities. We work on enrichment of the riparian area of the main creeks and rivers that support water utilities or aqueducts downstream. And we have developed a production restoration integration models, where each of the farms have a responsibility to help us connect the key ecosystems, the paramos with the forest, and that will bring different co-benefits for the farm itself, which could be carbon storage or improving runoff during dry season. Next slide, please. In terms of system-wide and multi-scale, what we are trying to do, and we've been working on this for the last 5 years, is to involve multiple water users upstream and downstream. Each of them have different activities and responsibilities to help us manage water resources. We have focused on the upper watershed in productive activities, restoration activities, and monitoring. Here I want to say that it's very important what Anika was saying, that our biggest challenge is not only about technical or understanding what are going to be the changes in water resources, it's more about how to engage all the stakeholders from the government, from the private sector, but also I think that the biggest answer for water management will come from communities and people that live there. So involving them since the beginning and the design of the ecosystem-based adaptation strategies, and then the way that they can involve actually makes a huge difference on how we can implement and at the end have a better water resource management. Next slide. So just a couple of examples of how we are involving these water users upstream. Basically, what we want to do is to change the agriculture dynamics, where they are very dependent on water resources such as potato production and cattle, to change it to different ways of income, such as have a antibiotic-free eggs. That's one thing that has a lot of impact on the income of the families. Beekeeping, silvopastoral system, organic gardens. All these, what it looks for is to reduce the demand of water in agriculture and to improve well-being of the people that live there. I think that it's the main goal of this strategy. Next slide. And at last, how we have approached these innovative or persistent characteristics of transformative adaptation. First of all, introducing climate change information system and participatory monitoring on temperature, water, and soil conditions. We have right now 38 families that are doing participatory monitoring every day, 6 a.m., 6 p.m. in the afternoon. They take different measures of precipitation and temperature, and actually what this is making is that the people that live there are more connected with the hydrological cycle, and they are understanding how the way they use water resources will affect them in the upper watershed, but also how the way that they manage water here will affect downstream. And the participatory monitoring is the tool to connect people. And also we've been working a lot on strengthening regional water management institutions to understand how ecosystem-based adaptation strategies could be into their development plans and how these could actually have benefits in terms of the society itself. I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Natalia, for this excellent and very inspiring presentation. Someone is not on mute. I just want to quickly hand over to our discussant, André Verli, who's going to bring his reflections to this after these presentations. And I would just ask the person who's not on mute to please mute themselves before that happens. So André Verli, he's the Regional Water Advisor in Central Asia for the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. And before that, he worked with SDC's Global Program on Climate Change and Environment. So he has some relevant questions and perhaps reflections on the two presentations we've just heard. So André, over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I hope you can hear me. I had some connection issues. And thank you for inviting me to share some thoughts. And also thanks to Annika and Natalia for your presentations. Yeah, I try to give you some thoughts, reflections about what I heard from my perspective as Regional Water Advisor in Central Asia. And let me start with a word on Central Asia, as many of you might not be very familiar with this fascinating region, which is inter alia at the geographical center of the famous Belt and Road Initiative, but also known as the home of the RLC disaster. So Central Asia is a semi-arid region, but it's not per se a water-scarce region. And it is a region where water is still very relevant, mainly for agriculture, but also for the energy sector. About 20% in some countries, the contribution of agriculture is about 20 to 30%, sorry, to the country's GDPs, and that's mainly through irrigated farming, and almost 30% contribution to the aggregated energy production of the region. Currently in the RLC basin, including Afghanistan, almost about 95% of the total water resources available in the watershed are utilized. Water is thus very, very important, and it is also very unequally balanced between the countries. There are 5 former Soviet republics in the region, which share 2 major river basins, Sirdarya and Amudarya, and both of them originate in the mountains in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. So meltwater from the cryosphere, we all know that what that means now, supplies about 80% of the water to the total water runoff. And in the last past half century, the glaciers of the region's mountains have melted up to 30%, and a further third is expected to melt by 2050. So of course, as this goes on, communities are at risk of flooding in the short term, and more particularly of more extensive episodes of drought and water scarcity in the future. So the role of the mountain cryosphere as water towers in Central Asia is really more than evident, or at least it should be, and that's the issue. Everybody should understand that water is a key driver of the economy in Central Asia, and thereby it's all changes that you can see happening to the cryosphere will ultimately result in changes in the economical setup. And thereby it's not only the decrease of water, but it's also the change in seasonality, the timing of when the water actually comes. The right amount of water at the right time, that's really crucial for the irrigated agriculture in Central Asia. So based on that, in an ideal world, people would just now start acting along the lines of what we've learned from the 2 presentations. That means work on improving the data and information base, including projections of regional climate and so on, to reduce remaining uncertainties. Move away from information to action-based, on a risk-based approach to start the needed transformation. And I really very much like the term transformative adaptation. That for me includes the permanent endeavor to get better adapted. But also the change of behavior, for example, the water consumption that we learned about or heard about. And last but not least, also develop and strengthen integrated and regional approaches. So basically move from competition to cooperation. But what is the reality as we see it so far in Central Asia? The role of the water towers and the impact of climate change are not yet clearly understood by a large audience due to several issues, and these include a poor understanding and a low awareness of people, including decision makers. They just stick to the business as usual as long as possible. Then we have a weak information base in Central Asia, and that is mostly based on the underlying data scarcity and the low capacities of institutions, but also individuals. And then we also have a low willingness for transformation and cooperation with neighbors. Remember, most of these countries basically just started their life 30 years ago when the Soviet Union collapsed. So in the last decades, their focus was primarily on nation building. So with these points, we already have the major tracks of which we are actually working on as Switzerland and will continue to work on. One is the awareness raising issue. We really need to get a better understanding in the heads of all the different layers. And I think it was Natalia who just said that one of the largest challenges is actually to mobilize all stakeholders. And that's really a huge need so that everybody has the understanding that is needed. Then we have to strengthen the information base. We have worked on that as Switzerland for a couple of years now, particularly in the cryosphere with cryosphere monitoring. And we would like to move also into provision of useful climate services, so really bring the data down to the ground. And then finally, we need to introduce some demonstration cases really to foster cooperation and transformation. So we have several projects, not least also Blue Peace Central Asia, who try to bring in elements. We work a lot also with youth, just in order to slightly but steadily move towards a more comprehensive and integrated approach. So it's a very long endeavor, and it costs a lot of effort. And what is most important, there is no alternative to it. I think that transformative adaptation is the first choice, if not the only. So we will try to do our level best to support the countries in Central Asia on their way, and I hope the same is true for you in your regions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, André, for this really clear outline of the challenges that you face in Central Asia. I've just pasted the link to the Blue Peace Initiative in Central Asia in the chat box in case people here are interested to find out more. And we have a lot of questions that have come through to our chat box. So I would like to start by two questions that I'm going to blend into one. Which are kind of a nice transition from your intervention, André. So there's a question from Ansgar Fellendorf who asks, which also joins an earlier question by André, which says, you mentioned transformative adaptation as potentially more effective than necessary in mountain cryosphere. What should be the objectives and principle of this, and how do you convince stakeholders to come along? This is directed to you, Annika. And André also says, can you share good examples of how to bridge the gap between science and policy? How do you convince decision makers on transformative adaptation? So, Annika, would you like to share some thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. And of course, I think for both of them, communication is key. Maybe starting with André's question about uncertainties and the fact that decision makers don't like it, don't like to deal with it. As I said, I think the key really lies in communicating uncertainties in a way openly, but also in a way that's understandable. And apart from communication, I indeed think that it also needs capacity development with decision makers. In one of our research projects, we have made some good experience in using probabilistic forecasts with the inland shipping in Germany. So when you can give a number of, there's a 70% risk of failure, that the level of water is too low for the ships to go further downstream in the river. So that was something what decision makers could deal with, or they learned how to deal with that. So I think probabilistic forecasts can be helpful there. But what I think is really important is to communicate those uncertainties openly, because otherwise, if you are precisely wrong, I think the results can be even worse than having people to deal with those uncertainties. The second question by Andreas Fellmann. So what would be the objectives of transformational adaptation and how to convince stakeholders? Again, I think, of course, communication is key. An important factor, I think, is to draw a potential positive picture of the future. Sometimes by engaging people that way, I think you can reach more than in a way of showing just the threat of what will happen if you don't do something. So this provides more opportunities, I think. The objective of transformational change is, of course, to not come to that point where the system breaks down. So that's why the system of water use, or the system of how people earn their income and make their livelihoods. So again, those risk assessments, and they can be done also in a rather simple manner, showing like how much water they would need, at what point will they not be able to really sustain the system anymore. And if you can demonstrate the risk of this and how likely that is and what would be the consequences of that, I think that will also help to understand and convince people that they need to change systematically. Thanks.
Thanks, Annika. Yes, challenging. And I want to also ask the same question or a related question to Natalia. Natalia, in your very interesting presentation, you showed that you managed to engage with a wide range of stakeholders and convince them for the need to transform approaches. And can you tell us how challenging that was? What worked better or what worked not so well? Perhaps just some experience from your side would be very welcome.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. I think that's the biggest challenge. I will say that having a clear picture of the water resources dynamic and how it will affect each of them, each stakeholder in different way. It's key, having a clear theory of change, a clear cause and consequence analysis of what happens if you don't do things. It's crucial to engage everyone. I think that here what you have to develop is a collective vision of, in this case, of a landscape, but it could be of a watershed. We have 5 watersheds here, so we have 3 different environmental authorities, 22 mayor offices, more than 300,000 families living in the rural area, and then 8 million people in the city. What will happen if water, as we know right now, as the access to water that we have right now doesn't work for everyone? And making each of the stakeholders aware of their role in the watershed, what are their demands in comparison of others, and what is their, and also showing them what is the clear way of them to support or to promote water resources conservation or ecosystem services conservation. I think that it's a key. I will say again that Annika was very, very clear about communication. Communication is the key. And at the end, I think that one of the biggest successes that we had in the last years is that we have a way to evaluate or have an economic valuation of ecosystem services, and then transforming the urgency, not only in terms that you will not be able to have water access in the future years, but also that this will affect the economic growth of the region and depending on the stakeholder that you're talking about. If you're talking with public stakeholders that wouldn't have the competitiveness that is having water for industrial resource, for industrial sector and for the city, and how that will affect the economic growth of the city and the region, that has been a very clear and straightforward way to engage public sector in this strategy. So I think it's a useful tool.
Great. Thank you, Natalia. And while I have you on the line, I just want to follow up. There are lots of questions for you in the chat box. I don't know if you had a chance to see some clarification questions. One from Alicia, who asks, how did you determine the Paramos conservation area, the yellow line in your slide? What elements were considered for that? And the second question from Cesar Portocarrero from Peru, who asks about irrigation systems. In the Andes, they're very old, so it's necessary to improve them. Is it the same in Colombia?
Okay, the first question. So we developed, the base of everything is where the water comes from. So basically we had an hydrological modeling trying to identify the water sources for the Bogota water supply system. That was the first thing to do. And then based on that, try to understand what was the water utilities from the rural areas that benefit from the same watersheds. That was the basic map, I will say, that we were working on. And then after we identified those strategic watersheds that we should work on, then we add the administration boundary. Here in Colombia, I don't know how it is in other countries, but in Colombia, municipalities or the municipality boundaries, they are not aligned with the watershed boundaries. So basically what I have here is an intersection between where the water comes from and how the watersheds drain to the region where water supply for Bogota was being taken, and then how it aligns with some administration boundaries. That was basically the way that we selected that region. Each drop of water that comes from precipitation within that yellow line goes for a water utility. Someone is using it. So that was the basic concept to determine that line. In terms of irrigation system, yes, I mean, a lot of, let's say that we don't have big irrigation areas here. Mostly we around this area, we have 800 millimeters per year of precipitation. Sometimes in the upper watersheds of Chingasa, that is the national park, we even have sometimes in the year 5,000 millimeters per year. So we have a lot of water. But due to climate change, the dry season, which is between January and March, we have been experimented some water scarcity. And that's why we are promoting irrigation systems and reservoirs. Because in these 4 months of dry season that we have, water conflicts has exacerbated very fast. In the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of water conflicts that we haven't had that rate before, and that's why we are promoting irrigation strategies. But yes, we have to move first to a better technology and also improve agriculture activities to make them reduce the water demand.
Thank you. And Natalia, I think we have time for one more question before we have to slowly start closing down this webinar. And I would like to ask the question that Philippe posed earlier to Annika. Can you predict climate tipping point related to melting glaciers? When do you know that business as usual is no longer acceptable?
I think these are two different questions. The question on when business as usual is not anymore possible is also a societal or political decision to what, and I think it should be the stakeholders that decide on what are their criteria for. So what are their goals of water resource management? Do they want to provide water to at least 10% of their farms, or 20 or 30? So that's a more of a political decision, and this decision should be taken with engaging stakeholders to define those criteria. Then for the tipping point of glaciers, I think it's a bit difficult to define of what would be the tipping point. I mean, you have the one tipping point of peak water where you'd say that while annual discharge increased up to that point and then will decrease, and that can be predicted. But then there's if you are thinking of tipping point in the sense of irreversibility, that's often mentioned when glaciers actually disappear, because then it will be very difficult that they build up, even if the climate was getting colder again, or it would take very, very long time. And I think that, so in the definition of tipping point of how long it could take. And I agree. I think Daniel had already also given an answer. So glaciologists can model that, of course, again with uncertainty. But this is when the glaciers were really disappeared. Before that, they may also increase again if the climate got colder. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Annika. I just want to hand over to Daniel for some closing words. But could you please, for those of you who are still online, could you please rate today's webinar from 1 to 10 in the chat box and give any appreciations or suggestions for improvement that you may find? Many thanks. And Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much. Melissa, I will make another closing remark than the regular ones, thanking everybody, etc., etc. Just sharing one more, for me, important thought. I think what we can take out of this webinar and the trend sheet is the urgent need to be fastly adapting and transforming. What we have left as cryosphere, except for the poles, is in high mountain regions. So it's the third pole of the Himalaya Hindu Kush mountain range, for instance, or some places in the Alps. And even in Switzerland, we have these irrigation systems in the Valais, as many of you know, that are similar to those used in other regions of the world, channeling water to specific places where agriculture needs the water. Now, what I want to say is that in the Atlas Mountains, for instance, or in other places in Africa where there are or were ice caps and snow, permanent snow, or at least temporary snow previously, these have disappeared, as we know, and they have developed new ways of storing water, which are mostly small scale. In the Atlas Mountains, they're called cherish. Now, when I worked in Tajikistan or in Central Asia, I came across and came to know that in Tajikistan, there were similar ways of storing water, small scale, like a swimming pool size, you know, for different farmers. So I really think that we need to move fast towards anticipating the disappearance of this melting water and need to find ways to store this water, as was said by Natalia as well. We do not have the time that the paramos had to develop, to grow, because that took, as I'm informed, much longer than the rapid decline we are facing right now. So we need to be smarter and anticipating. Thank you so much for this interesting exchange this afternoon and for the moderation, Melissa. Back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel, for these closing remarks, spurring us into action. And thank you, everyone, for your comments, for your engagement, and for your questions and suggestions in the chat box. It's really good seeing so many people connecting from everywhere. And I just want to really thank everyone who's been involved also in organizing this webinar, especially our speakers, Natalia, Annika, and Andre. Thank you all, and you will find the recording and the presentations on the link that we will share with you in the chat box and by email later. Thanks a lot and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.